Hi, welcome to the Parenting Literacy Show. The purpose of this show is to help parents by providing them information they can use to raise children who are healthy, intelligent, happy, have good social skills, and are spiritual. My name is Dr. Joseph Lau. I'm a developmental psychologist who's been studying how humans develop for the past 40 years or so. For the past 16 years, I've been focusing on parenting and how they can raise their children. Today, I'd like to talk about racism. And this is the second part of a two-part series that I'm doing. Hopefully you heard the prior interview. And so today we are blessed to have with us Dr. Lawrence Hirshfeld, who is a professor of anthropology and psychology at the New School for Social Research here in New York City. He's been studying racism from the anthropological and cultural perspective for quite some time. And so he's very knowledgeable about this. And so thank you, Dr. Hirshfeld, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's begin by looking at the basics. And how would you define racism?
I guess the first thing I would say is that we probably should, and this would be something that the anthropologist in me would start with, would talk about racisms, because there is no simple and universally shared notion of what represents a racial group and what represents a racial boundary. The North American model is closely tied to differences that we can imagine that are traceable to the continent of origin. So you have people who were from East Asia, and you have people who were from Northern Europe, and you have people from Sub-Saharan Africa, and people from South Asia, and so on. And we kind of use those as basic guides to figure out, oh, these are the races of people in the world. And then there's an enormous willingness to evaluate people in terms of the category that they belong to. But these kinds of racial differences are historically relatively recent. People before well, certainly before the 10th century, didn't really run into too many people that came from continents other than the continent they were descendants of. And so earlier systems of racism, and many of the existing systems of race and racism, involve people that don't look very different from each other. And we have a very strong sense of phenotypic differences as being very important. But that's not the way a lot of people in the world imagine racial differences to be. So the long history of the British and the Irish was a major racial difference, and it satisfies just about anybody's definition of what a racial difference would be, but it didn't involve people that looked a whole lot different. I just finished doing a study in Turkey with a colleague in Oslo, and we were looking at Turkish participants' beliefs about Armenians. Now, again, Armenians and Turks don't look all that different, and we actually took pictures of people, but they were all Turks. We didn't have any pictures of Armenians, but we told people that some of these people were Armenians and some of them were Turkish. And the Turkish participants would say, "Oh yeah, I can see the difference. I can tell them apart and stuff." And of course their sortings were random until we gave them names. We said, "Well, this," and then we would give them names that had some hints to ethnicity, and people said, "Oh yeah, and yeah, you can see." And they had all of the kinds of judgments. They made all of the kinds of evaluative judgments that Americans make about blacks and whites and so on. So each historic moment and each kind of cultural community will have its own idea of what is and what isn't a racial difference. But race is a very porous and promiscuous idea. Porous in the sense that although we would like to think that racial boundaries are clear, and they're very clear to children, for instance, we imagine. But the boundaries aren't very clear. And in fact, young children don't pay much attention to it in a lot of ways. They pay much more attention to how people talk about groups And so they learn what the relevant groups, including racial groups, are in their society by the way their community talks about other people, long before they're concerned with how people look.
Now, there's also this idea of systemic racism that's floating around. Is this something you're familiar with? And is this an actual thing?
Oh yeah, yeah. Identifying who people are in the sense of where they fit in a web of social relations is a critical task for the child to pick up. And that involves paying attention to community norms and the things that the community believes. The children are just, they're trying to get the right accent, as it were. They're trying to get what it is that the community believes. And unfortunately, because of systemic racism, because of the depth of racism, the importance of racism to maintaining the way our society is organized, you're kind of trying to swim upstream to get your kid not to pay attention to precisely this systemic racialization of the world.
When you say that racism is part of the way we structure our society, that comes a little bit as a surprise to me. And I'm wondering if you would elaborate on that.
I'll give you a pretty good example. COVID vaccines. We haven't felt any need to actually share fairly and equitably our store of vaccines with the rest of the world, and the distribution of these vaccines and their availability is deeply racialized. About 7% of the population in Africa has been vaccinated. We can do that because we can blind ourselves to the consequences of our acts.
Can you elaborate maybe in terms of those consequences? Right? Based on what you just said, clearly some of the consequences are economic. Right? Are there any other maybe psychological consequences, especially for children in the United States, because of racism?
Sure, and the physical correlates, the medical correlates of being constantly aware of the racialization of society and the inequitable distribution of our society's resources cause people to be sick. If you're constantly stressed, that means you're saturated with hormones that in the end ultimately are not good for you and shorten your life. And if and then of course you got poverty and crime, and the hyper segregation of American society, where we really don't have a lot of mixed, diverse environments, allows us to just not pay attention to what it's like for people who are living just on the other side of the tracks, literally. And that's costly to people, but the damage occurs and is more, and is harder to accept and realize. And that's the kind of lesson of, if you will, of systemic racism. It's systemic so that it's like water for fish. You don't see it. You don't perceive it on a conscious level.
I think that it's clear to a lot of people that the victims of racism are suffering from racism, but you also suggested something else, and that is that perhaps the perpetrators also suffer, and perhaps society more generally suffers as well. Could you talk about that, please?
This is something which ebbs and flows. There are a lot of people who don't feel that we should be living in a particularly equitable society, and they're probably not too upset about their attitudes or that there might be inconsistency in their attitudes. But a lot of people also feel that we should be living in an equitable society, and that their actions are in conflict with that a lot of the time. And so because that would make them uncomfortable, they recruit things that allow them to be able to not see the consequences of their actions. that usually in the end causes stress and is problematic. But the biggest problem is not, ultimately, the biggest problem is social rather than individual. I mean, people, we end up living in societies that are that allow the exploitation of lots of other people, and we accept it, and I don't think that's a great thing for us.
Would it be accurate to say that by depriving victims of racism of access to resources, that we also deprive our society more generally of access to maybe good ideas or contributions from people that
Sure.
might be able to make contributions?
There's no doubt that having a diverse uh, habitat is valuable.
Now, are there some characteristics of children that protect them against racism?
Well, you mean as targets or as being, as
Well, yeah,
having,
actually, yeah, good question. As targets, actually,
yeah,
maybe
well,
both. Yeah, let's say first as targets.
yeah. I mean, what you get, one of the, in a sense, one of the advantages of the hyper segregation of American society is that a lot of kids of color grow up in environments which are not terribly diverse, so they're environments in which racism is less palpable, if you will, and that buffering probably is helpful. Then they have to eventually start going to school and encountering a wider, a broader society, and they become aware of it, and they have to learn to deal with it. It usually means involving some kind of of um, of biculturality. You learn to be competent in a more diverse set of circumstances. But actually, at least Black children and Black adults have pretty good self-esteem. Often better than a lot of people, a lot of majority people in the States. So clearly, it doesn't have to damage you in a. The damage, it involves how you're going to be able to negotiate society, and particularly a society in which your performance doesn't predict how well you'll be doing. That's pretty costly.
So part of the challenge then is doing this at the social level, where we want to help people avoid some of those social stereotypes that we were talking about in terms of systemic racism. But
Yeah.
what about the individual parent? What can they do to help bolster their child against these kinds of threats to their identity and performance?
The kids have already bought into a more accurate image of American society, and so telling them that it's only skin deep when in fact people act as if it were a lot more important doesn't change the children's mind. And if you look at these interventions and you look at what correlates uh, there are to the parents who do better, it's almost always how diverse their friendships are. So parents who have friends who are peers, right, not employees, but peers who are of color, tend to have kids who have less racist beliefs. There was a really disturbing study where people saw somebody's hand and they saw it being lightly stabbed, and then they looked at what kind of responses people had. And it turns out that white subjects watching a Black person's hand being stabbed were less distressed than they watched a white person's hand being pricked. And that was true for almost all of the majority subjects, except for ones who had some romantic involvement with a person of color. I mean, if you have close relationships with people of color, that'll not only change your attitudes, but it'll change your children's attitudes. The problem is the hypersegregation makes that difficult. Doesn't make it impossible, though. One way to make it more possible is to involve your kids with activities in which there's more diversity, but particularly activities in which there's diversity among the parents.
So it seems like on the one hand, the hyperpolarization causes children to be around other people that are like them, which then bolsters their self-esteem, but at the cost of not being exposed to a more diverse group of people that ultimately would help them avoid some of the racial stereotypes. Is that correct?
It's true, but it's not just contact. I mean, contact, look, if contact was what you needed to make people less racist, then plantation owners in the South wouldn't have been racist, right? Because they had tons of contact with people. A lot of people have contact with people. You tell it in an easier way. I did a study with French preschoolers, and we were asking them to remember stories in which people's age and gender and occupation and race were mentioned, but weren't important for the storyline. And we got the results of that, and it was interesting. But we also then asked them at the end of each session, could they name somebody who was Black or who was Asian, or in the school. And the very young kids I always dressed in black for this thing. The very young kids always said, "You're Black because you're all dressed in black." But once they were 3.5, 4, they were able to pick out people and mention, because there was always some kids or some teacher who was a person of color, and they were good at it. But what was extraordinary is that there were all of these preschool. These are preschool in France is a public school system, and it's a wonderful part of the French school system. So pretty much all kids are in preschool, and so they're in big institutional buildings. And every one of the preschools that I work at had a group of women who cook the meals and stuff, but they also were like these sort of grandmotherly figures for the kids, and they helped them get their clothes on and off for going out in recess and stuff. But they were also, if the kid was unhappy, it was also these people who attended to them and could soothe them. And so and most of these women were Black. Not a single kid, and I'm talking about, I can't remember how many kids we studied and how many preschools, but it was maybe a half a dozen preschools and well over 100 kids. No, many more than 100 kids. Not a single kid ever said, "Oh yeah, there's X or Y, one of these women," because these women were in this socially basically channeled and subordinate position. And the kids were drawn to them, liked them, interacted with them, but they were in a way blind to them, strikingly blind to them. And that's not a good start, because that's where adults go, unfortunately.
Wow. Is there anything else besides exposing the children to diversity that would help parents sort of protect the children against the effects of racism, either as perpetrators or as victims?
Yeah, I mean, I've often thought about what could I recommend, and I've always imagined that one of the possibilities would be to be more honest about it with children. I mean, one of the things that we do when we interventions that are done by our school systems and often by parents involve trying to get a person to feel good. They're nice people. They have neat customs. They have good food, and this has zilch effects on the child, because all they have to be is you walk down the street once and watch their mothers grab a purse when somebody goes by and go, I know what's dangerous, right? It's a strong signal. Lock the car door or whatever. But at the same time, and any parent who's served two kids a piece of cake for each knows that the sense of fairness is unbelievably acute in toddlers and young children. That you gave them a bigger piece than you gave them. That's not right, and there are wonderful, beautiful studies showing children's sense of moral judgment and also their sense of fairness, and that emerges in infancy, literally. So one of the things you can do is make the stories that we tell about the world, particularly historical stories, honest and accurate depictions of acts and their consequences. And